Good evening, everyone. This is being recorded on the 4th of February. This is your weekly Warcast ISW brief. We had a good show last night over the combat footage, as we usually do. Went over a lot of articles and had a good 3.5 hour show. But we're getting over back to our usual brief. But there is a lot of things that happen day to day with Trump in office, to say the least. I want to show you what happened just within the last couple of hours. Let me get over to our Telegram viewer real quick here. I have a couple of videos I want to show you. It relates to Gaza and another American adventure over into the Middle East. Um, yeah, to say the least, I'm a little pissed off at this, is putting it mildly. Um, but yeah, I'll let Blumph speak for himself here and hit play
The
here.
only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. It's right now a demolition site. This is just a demolition site. Virtually every building is down. They're living under fallen concrete that's very dangerous and very precarious. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live out their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back and do it again. The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too.
You heard that right. The U.S. is going to take over the Gaza Strip.
But again, the U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site, and get rid of the...
Look at this little Jewish fucker here, man. Just look at that little smirk on his face. He wrecks it, we have to buy it.
And get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area.
Here's Trump trying
Do a
to
real
eat that
job,
shit sandwich.
do something different. Just can't go
for
back.
jobs,
Go
it's gonna
back,
do the
it's gonna end up
economy
the
and
same
over to
way it has for
Israel.
100 years.
Fuck this guy, dude. There's another video related to that though. I've got to give the press a shout out on their pickup on this one. Does it mean American boots on the ground?
Mr. President, given what you've said about Gaza, did the U.S. send troops to help secure the security vacuum?
So Saudi Arabia is going to be
A
very
little
helpful, and
hats
they
there.
have been very helpful. They want peace in the Middle East. It's very simple. We know their leader and their leaders very well. They're wonderful people, and they want peace in the Middle East. As far as Gaza is concerned, we'll do what is necessary. If it's necessary, we'll do that. We're going to take over that peace, and we're going to develop it, create thousands and thousands of jobs, and it'll be something that the entire Middle East can be very proud of. But everybody feels that continuing the same process that's gone on forever, over and over again.
It's about as much of a smile I've ever seen in this little Jew's face here.
And then it starts, and then the killing starts, and all of the other problems start, and you end up in the same place, and we don't want to see that happen. So by the
in this decades-long struggle between Palestinians and Jews, because this guy's daughter married this guy's nephew.
United States, with its stability and strength, owning it, especially the strength that we're developing and developed over the last fairly short period of time, I would say really since the election, I think we'll be a great keeper of something that is very, very strong, very powerful, and very, very good for the area, not just for Israel, for the entire Middle East. Very important. And we'll, again, have thousands of jobs, and there'll be jobs for...
Jobs, blah, blah, blah. I mean, to say the least, that I'm a little pissed off is an understatement. We spent the last 20 years and untold amounts of treasure and blood over there, and this orange faggot wants us to go back over there and do it all over again for a spit of land that is 7 by 20 kilometers to throw away, God, so much, you know? I mean, it doesn't really matter to me. The American Empire is, at the behest of some other power, obviously. But to have it on our record the forceful removal of 2 million people. 2 million. And you don't expect that to have consequences. All because that little smarmy Netanyahu there. Fucking sakes, man. Yeah, whatever, What can you do? Just throw up your hands and say, well, at least I'm not going to be over there. That just means other guys, younger white men, are going to have to go over there and go and just help out Israel's little fucking ethnic genocide of another place, man. Holy shit. Holy shit. Anyway, so that's what happened today. And let me get back into introducing the show. But that was a news bombshell, to say the least. And you can expect the same sort of ambivalence from conservatives, from MAGA people, and even probably support. The So it's become all too tiresome and all too predictable. Um, what we see, sorry, I just saw this here. I gotta share it with you guys. This is probably what we will be seeing over in Gaza eventually. The Trump Hotel Gaza. Oh gosh, it's all too possible. It's all too possible. Anyway, the future is a little crazy. We're only 2 weeks into this fucking administration. Holy crap! What if anyone has a hair loss problem? You can expect to lose it by the end of this administration. And the reaction has been fairly tepid from conservatives, from what I could see. A lot of confusion, to be honest. They're like, "Are we going back and putting boots on the ground again in the Middle East? Are we going to find a new sandbox?" And the left is doing their usual stomping in the street, waving their flags, and the usual impotent sort of responses they ever put out. But yeah, there's got to be some way to stop this. It's just madness. It's just pure madness. And yeah, I mean, Israel could not destroy Hamas. I said this on the show last night. For the guerrilla to win, he only has to not lose, because it's a political victory, right? For the conventional army to beat the guerrilla, they have to win politically. And because Israel cannot solve that problem, the political solution to Hamas ruling Gaza, they failed. They had military victories, the same thing with us in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Militarily, every fight was probably won. And at the same time, because the politics of it were so bad and there was no solution, we failed in Vietnam, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Iraq, Israel failed in Gaza, same thing. But now, because Israel is just throwing up their hands and walking away from the mess, they got to go over to Blumph there and say, "Well, we broke it. You got to buy it." Ugh. And that's, I don't know, just frustrating, just amazingly sad, just fucking sad. Anyway, so that's what's going on today. So let's cover the last week over in Ukraine. And we'll be covering from the 27th to the 2nd of February. I do have one article that came out also today, or a couple days ago, from militaryland.net. There is an expansion of the responsibilities of the Azov brigades. Fairly good development for nationalists in Eastern Europe, being able to be institutionalized to a higher echelon of military organization is always a good thing. And we'll get into that a little bit. The brief is a little bit shorter than usual. ISW has been pulling back their stuff a little bit, so I might, if we don't go too long, talk a little bit about the Congo. The ISW put out a weekly Africa brief, so we'll go over that a little bit, show some maps, and discuss a little bit more. But let's just dive right into it, and let me open up the PowerPoint. Let me make sure it's the correct one. Yep, and we'll do the transition here. Okay, guys. Okay, we'll start over in Kursk. Russian forces have not made any notable advances the last week. Ukraine marginally advanced in northwest Pogrebki, which is north of Malaya Lochnia right here. Sorry if you can't see my mouse. Okay, anyway, so you follow the blue line here up where Malai Lochny is in the center of the map there. That's where Pogrebki is. Developments of note in this area: Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation head Lieutenant Andriy Kovalenko stated on the 28th that North Korean forces have not learned to counter, Ukrainian drone artillery strikes and have suffered significant losses as a result. North Korean officers are working to remedy these mistakes, has been reported by Russian commanders. Um, and Ukraine Special Operations Commander told Sky News on the 27th that North Korean troops appear to have temporarily withdrawn from the front line in Kursk after suffering significant losses and may be tending to the wounded service members or awaiting additional reinforcements. I do believe, I don't think I put it in this brief this week, there was a statement by South Korean intelligence that North Koreans are expecting another injection of troops sometime in March. Don't know the exact numbers, but that's what's been floating around. Ukrainian commanders suggested North Korean troops will return to combat soon, however. They've been gone for about 2 weeks now. Other Ukrainian service members told Sky News that North Korean forces appeared unaware of the threat of drone artillery strikes when they first arrived in Kursk and often operating easily identifiable groups of 20 to 60 personnel. And Ukrainian service members reiterated that North Korean and Russian forces have poor communication due to the language barrier, and that North Korean troops have higher quality small arms and uniforms than Russian forces, but often lack access to armored vehicles and must attack and transport supplies on foot. Interesting. Ukrainian General Staff reported on the 31st that Ukrainian missile artillery strikes destroyed a Russian command post in Ryilsk. This was supposedly a command post of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Don't know if there were any casualties or who died in that, though. But ISW geolocated footage on the 10th indicating Russian forces crossed the international border and advanced west of Zorovka, and Russian Milblog previously claimed that Russian forces crossed into Sumy Oblast, which is, again, behind Sudza here, in an effort to bypass Nikolayev Darino, east of Sucha. So that would be somewhere in this area, I imagine. And lastly, spokesman for the Ukraine Brigade operating the Kursk Oblast stated that Russian forces are increasing guided glide bomb strikes against Kursk Oblast. Ukrainian forces released and destroyed about 19 heavy and light Russian armored vehicles during an unsuccessful Russian attack, after which Russian forces switched to attacking the small infantry groups. And yeah, all right. Over the Kharkiv front here, guys. A bit of a map update, specifically in Vovchansk. Ukrainian forces advanced along Holia Street, moving behind the aggregate plant there, it looks like. Um, Other notes here, Ukrainian Border Guard Service reported on the 27th that Ukrainian forces repelled a Russian assault with 10 pieces of equipment and an unspecified amount of infantry near Vovchansk. The commander of Ukrainian brigade in the same city, um, yeah, the 27th stated that Russian forces assaulted the Vovchansk aggregate plant daily in groups of 3 to 10 personnel, including with male and female convict recruits. Interesting. That's where they went. Okay, that's the first report I've seen of that. Ukrainian drone battalion operating Kharkiv Oblast published footage that Ukrainian forces struck a Russian Buk M3 air defense system and occupied Kharkiv Oblast. So that's it for Kharkiv, guys. Going over to Luhansk. Again, yeah, these are fairly quick briefs nowadays, guys. It's not a whole lot of news coming out from ISW about these things. They're still publishing about 80 to 100 sources a day, but yeah. Luhansk. So we do have a bit of a explainer at the within this front, but in the next pages here though. So we'll explain an operational doctrine that might be developing here for the Russians. Positional changes. Russian forces recently advanced west of Orlyanka, which is east of Kupiansk in this area, and Russian forces west of Makivka, which would be right about here. Okay, develop some note in this area, guys. Ukrainian brigade operating the Kupiansk direction stated Russian infantry attacks in groups of 2 to 30 personnel. So again, small pair to a platoon-sized elements. Spokesman stated Russian forces first attacked with less trained infantry who identify Ukrainian firing positions, and then after which better trained infantry attack behind Ukrainian forces' flanks. We had a fascinating extended piece of Russian footage during one of their like assaults. It was about a 30-minute video. But I don't think we've really seen a long video of the Russians assaulting anywhere like that. This particular attack was in the Donetsk Oblast on Velko Novoselka, and it was a big fucking shit show. And from my understanding, I guess that would be the sort of better trained infantry that were, their second um, echelon troops, if you can call them that. Because their first echelon are obviously their Mobics, their convicts, and anyone else they see as expendable, going scouting, dropping off ammo, being their camels to drop off supplies for the Russian assault, stuff like that. But this was a larger contingent that was dropped off by BTR 82s. There was a couple of minutes there where they were under cover fire from the cannon on that vehicle. The commander on his GoPro uh, received mortar fire, I guess. It was a large explosion, right in front of his face within a couple meters. He was behind a berm and he just started screaming his head off for a few minutes, but got himself recomposed and started directing the attack. But the tempo of the Russian assault was lackluster to say the least. Uh, there were 3 points really where they leapfrogged, and it took about 10 minutes each location to move from building to building. So what they did was let me think, they disembarked from their vehicles, lollygagged for like 4 minutes behind their vehicles, just trying to get everything assembled. It didn't seem like anyone knew what he was doing. The guy was yelling the entire time. Everyone got down, got behind a wall, stayed there for another 10 minutes. Or that was between the vehicles to there was a 10-minute juncture. Received some fire, put some fire down range. Drones came in and stuff. They run down the wall, what looked like about 100, 200 meters maybe, jumped a window into a warehouse and stayed there for 10 minutes, where they proceeded to be basically pinned by a Baba Yaga Ukrainian drone, and then sent 3 or 4 pairs of Russian soldiers with very little cover fire to another building somewhere. You really couldn't tell. They could have died for all we know. But then after that 10 minutes elapsed, they run to a building which is maybe a 50 meters away. And they just proceed to stay in that building for basically the rest of the video. But yeah, the command structure, the motivation of the soldiers was very apparent, and it was interesting to see. So, again, highly recommend to go watch on the show from last night. Russian mill bloggers continue to complain to the Russian military command about lying about battlefield successes, most recently in the Borova direction, which would be about in this area right here, which is a little south of Makivka, I believe. And Russian mill bloggers denied on the 27th the Russian MOD. January 20th claimed that Russian forces seized Novotorivka, claiming that Russian forces are still 1.5 kilometers from the settlement, that it has not been any movement in that area for quite some time. One mill blogger claimed that footage showing the Russian forces in the settlement was false. And mill bloggers noted that the Russian MOD's false claims of the siegers negatively affect ongoing Russian offensive operations in the area, as Russian commanders who think Russian forces have seized the settlement will not order strikes against the settlement, leading Russian forces on the ground not to have proper fire support during assaults. It's interesting. Um, Russian bloggers previously complained that Russian authorities lied about the seizure of Belhorivka, which is right in this area right here, south of Severodonetsk, and that Russian military command reportedly arrested and removed several commanders overseeing that sector in November 2024, which is true. Okay, Ukrainian Kharkiv Oblast head Oleh Snerchubov stated on the 28th that Russian forces have not seized Dovrichna and that fighting continues in the settlement. That would be near Kupiansk here, guys. The commander of the Ukrainian drone battalion up in the Kupiansk direction stated on the 28th that Ukrainian forces have repelled 4 mechanized assaults on unspecified echelons since January 22nd. And the commander stated that Ukrainian forces destroyed over 15 armored vehicles and tanks, roughly 80% of which Ukrainian forces destroyed with drones. The chief of staff of Ukrainian battalion operating the Kupiansk direction again stated on the 31st of January that Russian forces usually conduct assaults during the daytime and artillery strikes at night. All right. Yeah, so this is a bit of an explainer of the operations going on here for the Russians. And as you can see, they're trying to create the salient after pushing into, west of Berestove, to Kolsenivka. They reached a part of the Oskil River right here where they're trying to basically close off these salients right here. So it's been very slow going for the Russians, though. They were north of Sinkivka for quite some time. They pushed past it and have been stuck outside Kupiansk for some while. They've been ferrying soldiers across the river to Dolvrichna and trying to expand the bridgehead there north of Kupiansk. But we'll explain the reasoning of Russian logic and the pacing that they're growing accustomed to. Russian forces are expanding their salient north of Kupiansk as part of their long-term operational efforts to push Ukrainian forces from the east or left bank of the Oskil River. Russian forces operating along the Kupiansk, Svatove, Kremena line gradually intensified in September 2024 after a relatively low tempo period in early and mid 2024 during which Russian forces primarily conducted infantry assaults and occasional platoon-sized mechanized assaults in the area. Russian forces have recently intensified operations north of Kupiansk and the rest of that area right there. This is mainly overseen by the 6th Combined Arms Army. This is also assisted by the 1st Tank Guards Army, I believe, or Division. And the Russian military does not appear to have significantly. I'm sorry. Russian military does not appear to have significant uncommitted reserves to funnel into this effort, but the Russian military command may be willing to redeploy frontline units from another sector to the front line to exploit any significant tactical gains in the Dolvrichna-Kupiansk area. The Russian military command may want to redeploy additional elements of the 6th Combined Arms Army to the Dolvrichna area rather than redeploying them from another relatively inactive area, is redeploying forces that are relatively nearby and are subordinated to the same formation as the forces already in north of Kupiansk could help reduce the command and control and coordination issues between frontline units operating immediately north and northwest of Kupiansk. Russian forces have historically struggled with C2 issues when redeploying units from multiple discrete formations and areas of the front line to new efforts, a problem that was particularly notable during the Russian defense against Ukraine's incursion to Kursk Oblast. And Russian forces appear to be disseminating a doctrinal method for advances throughout the theater that aims to conduct slow envelopments of frontline towns and and settlements at scale that is reasonable for Russian forces to conclude before culminating. Um, Russia's Central Grouping of Forces' seizure of Avdiivka in February 2024 was Russia's first relatively successful envelopment after Russia's forces regained a theater-wide initiative in the fall of 2023. And Russian forces spent 4 months closing a gap of 12 to 15 kilometers wide and ultimately forced Ukrainian troops to withdraw under the threat of tactical encirclement. So that is a learning um, an evolution of the Russian tactics after beating their heads through the wall that was called Bakhmut. Uh, they also, at the same time, recommitted troops to frontline assaults like this in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. So it's not that they've completely moved away from assaulting settlements head on like that in some cases, but they are trying to preserve the manpower, it seems, in a sense. The advantages seem to be for the Ukrainians in urban fighting and with some maneuver in there too. The Russian advantage is in open fields with artillery. So even though that artillery advantage is diminishing, it seems like a lot of the sectors in the front, it seems like there's almost a parity of Ukrainian and Russian artillery for one. It seems like, um, yeah. Seizure of Avdiivka was likely served as Russian military command's blueprint for future envelopments in other frontline areas. The Russian Eastern Grouping Forces' effort to envelop Volodar successfully forced Ukrainian troops to withdraw from Volodar, and Russian forces seized the settlement in October 2024. Since there's not enough maneuver restored to the battlefield, they've been trying to figure ways of turning or forcing the Ukrainians to tactically withdraw from these settlements. The Russian military command appears to be experimenting with involving multiple military districts in a single envelopment. The Russian military command achieved significant tactical successes via envelopments in the Volodar and Velika Novosilka direction in fall 2024 and early winter 24 to 25. Possibly due in part to keeping these two operational efforts under a single command, the Eastern Grouping of Forces. Having a unified command over these directions likely help minimize coordination issues and ensure a cohesive unified vision in the operational level planning in the area. And last bit on this here, guys. Russian military command has shown that it is willing to commit to operations that could take to 6 to 9 months to conclude. Russian commanders are likely operating under the assumption or direct knowledge that Putin does not intend to end the war in the near future. And this might be an assumption for ISW, though. It would correspond still to the tempo of Russian offensives, though, which at the same time, how to put it, a lot of Western and Ukrainian sources are saying that they're betting on the Russian economy overheating and taking a nosedive at some point. We've been hearing that for the last 3 years, so don't invest everything in that. But at the same time, Ukrainian strategic long-range strikes have been targeting the Russian command structure, decision-making centers in some cases, and mostly oil and gas infrastructure. So that being the cornerstone of the Russian economy and also their federal budget, it makes sense that by targeting that and by lessening the output of oil and refined gas and oil for the Russians would help again destroy their economy in some sense and also increase sanctions on their shadow fleet. Uh, yeah, these things take time to manifest though, and Russians have been remarkably resilient in how they've been able to adapt around sanctions. But that's also partially due to their central banker. I forgot her name, Nabulina. As I keep saying, if the Ukrainian special forces could do something about dealing with her, that would be smart. There was a lot of pushback from Western commentators after Ukraine used a scooter to blow up a Russian general. I forget his name. It wasn't Lapin, but there was a guy that was in charge of the Russian WMD program. Essentially, he was in charge of like biological, radiological, and chemical weapons, and he died while coming out of one of his apartments in Moscow. And yeah, there was a lot of people, namely Preston Stewart and a couple others, but I remember Preston Stewart getting a lot of flack for that, saying that you can't do this to politicians and people in government, blah blah blah. This is what terrorists do, you know. And I'm like, this is the one guy you can do that to. He's literally in charge of the Russian WMD programs, and you can't go and kill him after they've been killing Ukrainian children in maternity wards. Like, why? Like, go fuck yourself. Anyway, so he think he caught off. He caught the right amount of flack for that too. He was being a hypocrite, and that's the sad thing about it. That's a whole different commentary. Is like the hypocrisy of Westerners, even against their own best interest. Like, oh, you can't do that because my principles. You can't go kill the guy that's in charge of Russia's nuclear weapons, even though you got dead babies. That's just bad. And anyway, it's just lunacy. Anyway, pushing on. Let's see here. Yeah, Mashevitz and a Russian mail blogger have suggested that Russian military command may intend to leverage advances near Dolvrichna and Volchansk to advance on Veliki Burluk from the northwest and southeast. Russian forces are currently 30 to 35 kilometers from Veliki Burluk, from their closest point of advance in the Kupiansk and Volchansk directions, respectively. And Russian forces could spend 6 months to a year making slow, grinding advances toward Veliki Burluk before they truly threaten the settlement. Russian commanders do not seem concerned about the speed or consistency of their advances in Ukraine, likely because they believe the war will drag on until Russian military defeats Ukraine. Um, yeah, let me read this part right here before I get into that. The Russian military command expended 4 months on the seizure of Avdiivka, spent most of 2024 working to level the front line in the western Donetsk Oblast, and has devoted the last 3 years to seizing the remainder of Donetsk and Luhansk, but does not appear particularly concerned with expediting these advances. Russia has previously articulated a theory of victory that assumes that Russian military will be able to continue gradual, creeping advances in Ukraine indefinitely, and has repeatedly indicated that has no interest in resolution of the war on any terms but those he dictates. Putin's commanders are internalizing these statements and likely coming to the logical conclusion that Putin has no interest in ending the war and intends to continue fighting until he accomplishes his objectives in Ukraine. Eh, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of commentary there. I don't agree entirely with their conclusions. Um, there has been some, well, supposed leaks from the Russian presidential cabinet people around Putin. Pardon me. There is supposed rumors that he is unhappy about the state of the Russian economy and the consequences it's going to cause for the Russian middle class, mainly uh, St. Petersburg and Moscow, right? And if the war continues to drag on, that's obviously just going to get worse. Their nominal inflation rate's above 20%, which Russian central bank had a meeting in December. They didn't decide to raise rates, but they didn't decide to lower it either, so it's still pretty high. And also, the longer this war drags on, because Russia does not have an expanding population, their labor pool is going to only continue to shrink, and they have to import labor as much as that is to the chagrin of Russian nationalists who support the war. It's just a vicious cycle of a snake eating its own tail at this point. I just don't see how ISW seems to be pushing the thinking that Russia thinks they can do it indefinitely. I think Russians are slow to adapt, but that's an institutional thing at the same time. And while they are taking painfully slow gains at their expense, that means that they're also draining their own body pool of soldiers that they can pull from now. And that's good. That's drying up though. Like we'll go into the mobilization here after the headlines, and that's only going up though. It's not going down. The Russians just can't afford to pay that much money to all these soldiers, and the tune of hundreds of thousands a year, you know, and they're paying tens of thousands of American dollars, while the dollar difference between the ruble and the dollars, over 100 rubles to a dollar now. It's getting nuts. Um, yeah, I just don't see how that's possible, much less valid for them to think that. I think they understand that they're against a wall in some case, but I don't know what else they think they can do. If that makes sense. Um, if they think they can just continue to press and keep forcing the narrative that victory is inevitable, Russia's going to keep winning, blah da 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 da. At this point, that sort of shock wore off a long time ago. It's like, yeah, you're gaining 800 kilometers here one day, maybe a kilometer here, but then the Ukrainians counterattack for half a kilometer the day after. Back and forth, you lose more tanks, you lose more bodies. Ukrainians have bloody nose a little bit, but they're not at yeah, they're they're not really sweating it out of loss of bodies. They're sweating out because their mobilization process sucks. Um, and that's how it's just going to keep going. And anyway, it's a whole diplomatic political rigmarole about this though. But again, I don't think the Russians believe that they can do it indefinitely. They know there's some sort of timeline. I think they're trying to force the issue as hard as possible while they're still bleeding out. It's kind of that stubborn Russian logic, or yeah, I mean they'll just do it to spite you, like they'll keep fighting just to make your day worse, and still die in the end, right? Um, by doing that, that means they're going to force the issue on the table as hard as they can, but they'll have to accept concessions at some point. What that is, what those are, I have no idea, but we'll see how the diplomacy works. And go from there. I don't know. I just don't see it being on a long time horizon. I think 2026 will be the deciding. Well, it will be the year of decision probably when it does end. 2024 it's going to take a while for these negotiations to even get off the ground. And unfortunately, as you guys saw at the beginning of the show, Trump's first guest from a foreign country was Netanyahu, because that's where America's priorities are at. Anyway, the worst offensive method is bringing about slow operational maneuver on the battlefield, but these developments still require significant planning, foresight, and manpower and equipment to do so, and to restore rapid mechanized maneuver on the battlefield. Russian forces' recent developments have demonstrated that these efforts require substantial numbers of personnel, armor, and artillery systems to sustain their tempo of advance. That's the other thing. Like Russians are running out of artillery barrels. It was a paper I was reading mostly through. The Russians are not producing enough barrels to replace their worn-out barrels. They're just shooting. They've shot so many artillery um, shells out of those barrels that they're just running out of them. They have to go back and get refurbished or make new ones. Yeah, it is a bottleneck for the Russian industry right now. The personnel and vehicle losses that Russia is suffering to make these creeping gradual advances are unsustainable given Russia's current force generation and defense industrial capacities. Reports of Russian tank and armor vehicle losses in 2024 indicate, for example, that such losses will likely be prohibitive over the longer term, particularly as Russia continues to exhaust its finite Soviet-era stocks. Pardon me. Russia's current monthly recruitment rate is also likely either equal or just below, I think it is below, the quantity needed to replace Russia's monthly casualty rate 1-to-1. There are reports that select Russian regions are failing to meet their monthly recruitment quotas as citizens are less willing to volunteer to fight. We have a report from Moscow. We'll talk about the mobilization section that reflects that. Russia's ability to continue slowly enveloping settlements, instead of attempting to conduct rapid mechanized maneuver that penetrates Ukraine's defensive lines and quickly achieves operationally significant advances in the medium to long term, is contingent on Russia's ability to supply high quantities of personnel and material needed to sustain these operations. Okay, going over to the crux of the whole war in Donetsk. Russian positional changes. They made some advances at Chasiv Yar, seized New York, seized most of Toretsk. It looks like the Ukrainians counterattacked a little bit, and eliminated the pocket between Toretsk and Sherbanivka, which is west of Toretsk. And Ukrainians actually advanced in northern Toretsk a little bit last week and northwestern Toretsk. They also advanced in southeastern Koltne, which is west of Pokrovsk, and south of Zerove, which is southwest of Pokrovsk, and marginally advanced west of Novoandreevka. Some other stuff. I'm not going to include all the movements because there are operationally significant stuff that has happened, but again, these are degrees by streets and a few kilometers here and there sometimes. Developments to note in this area: Russian forces are increasing operating equipment, especially armored fighting vehicles in Chasiv Yar direction. Recently blew up pipes in the Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal in several places to create passages for armored vehicles, assaults, and logistics. So that for me, it seems like a turning point for the Russians in the Chasiv Yar direction. That means if they're able to move in these armored vehicles and support logistics better, that means that they're going to be upping the fight a little bit further in that direction, because that canal was a major bottleneck for their infantry. They eventually infiltrated north and south of the main defensive lines in that area and pushed the Ukrainians back a little bit. But now that they've created such a buffer zone between the Ukrainians and the canal, the Russians can now clear a space for the vehicles to move in. Spokesman for the Ukrainian forces in that sector stated on the 27th that there are a large number of small combat engagements near Pokrovsk, and that Russian forces are attempting to enter and develop Pokrovsk from the west. It's that big salient right here is developing southwest of Pokrovsk. Spokesman assessed that Russian forces operating in the Pokrovsk direction may have a decreasing number of personnel due to their attempts to bypass Pokrovsk on its flanks instead of conducting frontal assaults against the settlement. It's also noted that the size of the combat engagements near Pokrovsk are not as large as those near Toretsk, but stated that Pokrovsk direction is the most active direction of the front line. Whether they're shifting their attention from Pokrovsk to Toretsk would be interesting, but I don't know about that. Um, it would be a development. It would be a development because the fortress you can see right there with Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Drzivka, and Konstantinivka are the fortress belts, fortress city belt anyway. For the Ukrainians, though, that is their major backbone for their defense in the Donbass, basically. Tresk is just southeast of Konstantinivka. It'd be interesting if they decide to move away and then leave the front as it is in Pokrovsk and decide to focus on that. Um, Russians have done odder things. We'll see. And last thing here, spokesman for Ukraine Brigade operating the Pokrovsk direction stated that Russian forces use small columns of armored vehicles and tanks to disembark infantry, but noted that the open terrain of the Ukrainian Brigade's area of responsibility allows for such movement, as opposed to other areas in the Pokrovsk direction. All right, last thing going on here in the Donetsk front, guys. Russian forces are intensifying operations aimed at seizing Velko Novosilka. This might be an old one. I'm sorry. I think this is an older one. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I moved some stuff around and that was left in there by accident. I apologize. Anyway, Donetsk Frontier commander of Ukrainian drone platoon operating in the Pokrovsk direction stated that Russian forces are constantly attacking under a cover of fog and in small infantry groups, and that Russian forces have large number of infantry reserves. It stated that Russian forces sometimes launch as 30 FPV drones against a single Ukrainian position. The Russian forces often develop countermeasures against Ukrainian technology within 2 to 3 weeks, and that of Ukrainian technology appearing on the battlefield. It was also stated by Ukrainian military intelligence officer to The Economist that Russian forces are probing Ukrainian positions for weak points near Kharkov, then massing forces wherever they achieve small tactical successes. Um, we talked about Turretsk a little bit about the Ukrainians recapturing lost positions near Krimsky, and an officer of the Ukraine brigade operating the Turretsk direction stated that on the 1st, that Russian command mostly deploys mobilized personnel from occupied Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast to that area. Interesting. And the officer noted that Russian forces occasionally commit well-equipped and trained assault groups from other unspecified areas to the front line to assault operations in the Turretsk direction. Lastly, from here, guys, as stated by Siersky, the Russian forces have suffered more than 15,000 casualties, of which more than 7,000 were killed in action in the Pokrovsk direction in January alone. So, some stuff going on in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, actually. Uh, Russians seized a couple islands in a few spots in Zaporizhzhia. Russian forces seized Stepove, advanced northeast of Kopani. You can see on the map there, the Russian forces advanced north of Stepanivka, and it doesn't have, unfortunately for my SW, they didn't show Kopani or Stepove there. Anyway, Russian forces also advanced northward in the Dnieper River Delta, and they seized Nestra Island and recently seized Veliki Sokolin Island in the delta there. Some drone footage that was just drone footage. They didn't want to slow down the brief here, but it was verified by Ukraine's bombing Russians on the island there. Spokesman of the Ukraine brigade operating the Zaporizhzhia direction stated that Russian forces are using fiber optic drones more frequently. Seems to be the developing trend. Satellite imagery posted on the 21st of January shows that Russian forces built an additional protective structure at Belbek Air Base. And yeah, that's what we talked about earlier. Okay. And headlines about the peace negotiations again. Yeah, Putin. So he had a forum called the Valdai Club, and this happens about every year. This is where they talk about foreign policy and stuff. But we'll get into the details here. Kremlin indicated that Putin may not be willing to view any peace agreement with Ukraine as binding by claiming that the Ukrainian government is either unwilling or unable to rescind the 2022 Ukrainian presidential decree banning negotiations with Putin. The short of the long on that is that Zelensky said it was illegal to negotiate for peace with the Russian Federation around those lines. Essentially, what that means is, as him as commander in chief of Ukraine, it's only up to him to negotiate. That way, there wasn't any like fuckery going around where you know an oblast governor might just surrender an oblast to Russia or something like that. They would have it on books as law that you cannot negotiate these things away, that sort of thing. That was the logic behind it, but Putin's twisting the knife around and saying, well, you're saying you can't talk to us, so you got to get rid of this thing. That way he can kind of put the screws on Zelensky and kind of maybe piece out territory by negotiating at a lower level, too. That's the sort of fuckery Russia's trying to play with. Putin claimed that any agreement that Russia and Ukraine conclude before Zelensky rescinds his decree will be invalid. Putin further claimed that Zelensky is no longer able to legally rescind the decree because he's no longer a legitimate president. Again, because he declared martial law, and the Ukrainian constitution says you can't have elections during a time of crisis while there's martial law. Anyway, um, it was also said that Putin wanted to negotiate with the Ukrainian Rada, or i.e. the Congress there. The Ukrainian constitution does not empower the Rada to unilaterally rescind presidential decrees, however, and a decision to do so itself would violate the Ukrainian constitution. Kremlin officials, including Putin, have repeatedly used deliberately false interpretations of Ukrainian law and constitution to claim that Zelensky is the illegitimate president of Ukraine, etc., etc. Putin would likely seize an unconstitutional act by the Rada, even one he is now calling for, to declare an act of the Rada illegitimate and to stand up another strawman to hide the reality of his disinterest. in serious negotiations that recognize as Ukraine as an independent state. And Putin had previously claimed that the Rada is the only legitimate government branch of Ukraine, etc., etc. And Putin may intend to declare the Rada as legitimate in the future in order to justify his demands for a complete regime change in Kyiv and his unwillingness to negotiate with Ukrainian authorities. The Kremlin Newswire TASS reported an interview with the Validated Discussion Club director Fyodor Lukyanov on the 30th entitled, quote, "Don't Count on Big Agreements," unquote, highlighting the Kremlin's ongoing efforts to shape domestic and global expectations about the future negotiations between Putin and Trump. The Valdai Club is a national forum where the Kremlin officials, scholars, and foreign officials and other scholars meet to discuss international issues and has proven to be a useful tool in the Kremlin's decades-long efforts to influence Western policy. Lukyanov is a senior member and scholar at the Valdai Club who has repeatedly moderated Putin's annual speech at Valdai. Is considered a well-connected and authoritative voice on the Kremlin's foreign policy and goals and objectives. TASS's decision to leverage Lukyanov's interview to dampen. I'm sorry, let me go back here a bit. ISW is now prepared to. Yeah, anyway. But Lukyanov's statements in this interview are generally consistent with Putin's and other Kremlin's official statements about Russia's future negotiating position. So they're using him as a barometer for Kremlin's attitudes for negotiations right now. TASS's decision to leverage Lukyanov's interview to dampen domestic speculation about the possibility of a peace agreement in the near future also highlights the relevance of this interview and Lukyanov's statements when considering Russia's possible negotiating positions vis-a-vis Ukraine and the United States. Let's get into some of those details here. He stated in the interview that the main thing for future peace negotiations regarding Ukraine is not the territories, but addressing, quote, the root causes of the war, which Lukyanov defined as NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s. He stated with respect to Ukrainian lands, Russian forces now hold that, quote, with the territories everything is clear. How much you take is yours. Okay. Further indicating the Kremlin has no intention of compromising on its territorial gains in Ukraine in future peace negotiations. This position suggests. Well, let me pump the brakes on that real quick. During the whole thing with Bibi and Trump over the presser they had, there was a question and answer session, and there was I forgot the name of the reporter, but someone asked about demanding Russia give back the territories it took. I was rather surprised by that, and Trump gave another bloviated answer. I don't really remember his response because it was kind of insubstantial. And but the interesting thing is that that is being spoken at least at that level, which is important, I think, because what I've been seeing a lack of is again lack of consensus from Western governments in a unified front to force the issue on Russia to settle for a good peace for Ukraine, right? By part of that formula is also demanding the territory be given back to Ukraine, at least in a united front. At least make the effort to demand that concession back to Ukraine. If that's being pushed up to Trump at that point, that's good. At least it's being said publicly. But yeah, back to the Valdai Club thing here. This position suggests that Kremlin likely means for any future peace negotiations with Trump to start with the United States recognizing Russia's territorial claims over Ukraine, likely including that Russia does not currently occupy before actual negotiations can begin with the so-called root causes. Lukyanov stated that Russia's demand for future peace negotiations with Trump is a change for the security landscape of Eastern Europe and, quote, the abandoning of a large number of provisions on which NATO's existence and functioning are based. He stated that Russia may also want to discuss the possibility of reducing the level of NATO's military presence, presumably along Russia's borders, but noted that this is unlikely to happen. I mean, this is supposed to be a respected scholar in Russia, but at the same time, your invasion of Ukraine expanded NATO into Finland and Sweden. Like, your concern was there's a whole history behind this, and I've gone it over a dozen times. Um, but if this question comes up during the live show, I'll address it again. But the whole issue was essentially Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, NATO, and America, and the issue originally in 1989 was over the reunification of Germany. Both sides were like, "Oh, what are we going to do about this?" Because obviously it's going to happen. Gorbachev said he's not going to send tanks to keep these regimes in power in the Warsaw Pact, and Germany was headed toward reunification. And the United States had a verbal agreement with Gorbachev of the Soviet Union that uh, as soon as Germany joined NATO, that would be it in the Warsaw Pact. They wouldn't move east because the Warsaw Pact existed, right? So fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union dies and Russia becomes the Russian Federation. Those verbal agreements were never put down on paper, nothing was ever signed, and that was with a former government, a whole different constitution, and the world completely changed in those 2 years. So, over time, NATO moved east because Russia was invading Chechnya twice. They moved into Kyrgyzstan and did a few things in Kazakhstan and Syria. I mean, all these other areas, right? Like they were having a conflict every couple of years, basically, and they annexed several parts of Georgia, stuff like that, and they acted as the peacekeepers in Transnistria and in Armenia, which they failed to stop the Azeris from conquering part of Armenia. And anyway, it's a little silly to think that um, these previous discussions between a dead Soviet empire are valid for a new government that the Russian Federation simply isn't, and that's what they're trying to play it up as. There was never. This is an old Kremlin op, and they're saying, "Well, you said this thing to us this one time." It's like, well, you don't have the Warsaw Pact, motherfucker. Anyway, Kremlin officials have repeatedly alluded to the need for future peace negotiations to address the root causes of the war in Ukraine, which Sergei Lavrov defined in 2024 December as NATO's alleged violation of commitments not to advance eastward and aggressive absorption of areas near Russia's borders. Well, this is the other thing, guys. Um, Russia's worried about not having a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. Now, pardon me, a little water there. Um, how to put it? The Russian worry that they don't have enough control over their Eastern European neighbors is insulting to me, to say the least, because as a white nationalist, we believe that every white nation should have its own sovereignty as a nation state. At the same time, I fully acknowledge that there is undue influence from the United States and Brussels over a lot of these countries. However, at the same time, this is the whole mixed bag with Trump. He did wipe out USA aid at least for 90 days. It's on hiatus, and a lot of Western liberal institutions are panicking right now about that. So, that's kind of a win on principle for us. It's like, well, if the sovereignty of these nations can be respected without outside influence exerting that soft power on those institutions within those nations, that's a good thing. And not to mention also it benefits those nationalists within those countries to stand themselves up and have the space to speak proudly and freely in those public spaces in those countries. So that's a win, I would say. But at the same time, you have to look east because Putin is more about hard power and using the FSB to crack down on any dissent, clearly. And with people like Kalin Georgescu in Romania saying he wants to carve up Romania beside, all the other people he was saying that need to carve up Ukraine, like that's just plain treacherous. Anyway, leave it at that. Putin issued a series of demands to the United States in December 2021 ahead of his full-scale invasion of Ukraine that included, quote, one, NATO not commit to accepting Ukraine or any other countries as new members. Two, United States commit to upholding the alleged ban on NATO enlargement. Three, NATO not deploy any military bases that become NATO members after May 1997, that essentially include everything in Central Europe East. Also, next, NATO ban any military activity in Ukraine, Eastern Steppe, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, among other things. So that would include Poland, Georgia, Central Asia, like Afghanistan. Yeah, but that ain't gonna fly anyway. The Financial Times report on the 10th, citing a former senior Kremlin official and another source who discussed the topic with Putin, that Putin will maintain his pre-war demands for preventing Ukraine from joining NATO and forcing NATO to withdraw deployments from Eastern Europe in any future negotiations. Lukyanov's statements are yet another indication that Kremlin remains committed to imposing its will and security interests on the United States and Europe, and is not interested in compromising on this goal. Lukinov's statements assume that that Trump and his administration are weak. That's a anyway. That's if that is true, I would say that's a big mistake on the part of the Kremlin. He's been bending over a lot of Central American states pretty easily, and that Trump is more susceptible to being intimidated by the Kremlin's show of force uh, than the Biden administration. Sorry, the former Biden administration. Anyway, that was kind of throwing my brain for a loop there. Lukinov claimed that Trump wants to dump all further problems concerning Europe on sorry of concerning Ukraine on Europe and does not respect European states or NATO more broadly. That's debatable, but I can see that. Lukinov claimed that Trump may be willing to compromise NATO's foundational principles to appease Putin's demands for a NATO withdrawal from Eastern Europe and suggest that more broadly that Trump will abandon Ukraine and NATO. I don't think that's going to happen. Lukinov claimed that Trump only respects those who show steadfastness and called on Kremlin to never give in and to be prepared for a thoroughly tough conversation, including elements of a bluff, calling on Putin to strong arm Trump and demonstrate his resolve in future negotiations with Trump. Anyway, that is where they probably stand. And just a couple more things here, guys, kind of the bottom of the stack headlines here. The Parliamentary Assembly of the European Council of Europe, or PACE, adopted a resolution on the 28th of January defining its position on peace in Ukraine, closely echoing the principle of peace through strength that Zelensky previously outlined. The resolution called for unwavering European support to Ukraine and noted that sustainable peace negotiations can only be achieved from a position of Ukrainian strength. Resolution stated that the negotiations regarding an end to the war in Ukraine can only be conducted with direct Ukrainian involvement, and if Russia abandons its imperial ambitions, which it clearly is. The resolution also condemned Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and condemned Ukraine's progress. I'm sorry, and commended, sorry, commended Ukraine's progress toward European Union membership. Zelensky had previously highlighted the sustainable and just peace in Ukraine should be achieved through enhanced military support to Ukraine, especially given Russia's reluctance to engage in good faith negotiations to continue maximalist imperialist ambitions. Other thing here, a senior NATO official acknowledged that Russia is escalating a sabotage and destabilization campaign against European NATO member states to deter further military assistance to Ukraine. Um, NATO Deputy Secretary General James Apathurai, we'll just call him James, stated at the European Parliament on the 28th that NATO states have faced acts of sabotage in recent years, including train derailments, arson, attacks against politicians' property, and assassination plots against defense and his industry figures. They're talking about Rheinmetall's CEO there. It's fairly public, and including a Kremlin assassination plot. Yeah, it had to assassinate Rheinmetall head Armin Pappenberger. Papperger, sorry. Um, General James emphasized that Kremlin aims to create disquiet to undermine support for Ukraine and called for NATO states to be more assertive, to more assertively deter Russian sabotage efforts. Anyway, last thing here for the headlines, guys. Russian military continues to evacuate assets from the port of Tartus. Uh, Commercially available satellite footage showing of the port here. Uh, this was collected by Planet Labs. Shows between the 18th and 27th of January, the Russian military loaded equipment onto the Russia Spartan and Sparta 2 cargo ships at Tartus, and that the Sparta 2 ship left the port while Sparta remained. Open source military analyst analyst MT Anderson posted satellite imagery showing an oiler alongside the port and possibly suggesting that the Russian military was loading vehicles onto the Sparta. Anyway, it seems like they're moving all that stuff to Libya. And the Russian military likely formed a separate unmanned systems regiment at a military district level in order to augment Russia's unmanned systems capabilities. The creation of this regiment supports the Russian Ministry of Defense's recent coordinated efforts to establish an unmanned systems forces within Russian military and centralized control over the informal drone detachments. Um, there's a lot of stuff here, but basically they're just trying to, again, centralize influence and control over this new step in drone aviation and warfare. Um, but again, it always goes up towards the generals of these military districts. But that's what the Russians are trying to do. Russian forces will likely gain augmented drone support capabilities should the Russian MOD successfully form these new unmanned systems regiments and centralize its procurement efforts under the unmanned system forces. Although the success of this effort will depend on Russian military's commitments to to executing the necessary reforms and availability of resources. All right, over to the mobilization here for Russia. Volunteer recruitment rates in Moscow have dropped sharply as Russian citizens grow increasingly unwilling to serve in Ukraine. I would say Moscow is probably on the far end of the spectrum of people to recruit from because they're probably the most wealthy in Russia. And this is not, the middle of the spectrum where the chunk of people would be recruited from, but it is an indicator nonetheless. Russian opposition outlet Vertska reported on the 29th that the number of Russian citizens willing to volunteer to fight in Ukraine in Moscow has dropped significantly since Moscow's peak daily rate of 200 to 250 people in August 2024 to the current daily rate of only 40 people. Yeah, from 200 to 250 down to 40 a day. Just to let you know. Demographic makeup of these volunteers has largely shifted as ordinary citizens now comprise only half of the volunteers, while the other half are largely foreigners and individuals facing criminal and administrative charges. Vertska, citing sources in the Moscow mayor's office and interviews with foreign recruits, noted that um, more citizens, particularly from the People's Republic of China, African countries, and many post-Soviet countries, are signing contracts with the MOD and are drawn by the promise, of one-time payments of about $19,140. Pretty decent even for most modern American enlistment, but that's a lot for Russians. Russia continues recruiting prisoners to fight against Ukraine. Uh, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, or GUR, reported on the 30th that Russia plans to recruit 126,000 personnel from detainees in prisons and pretrial detention centers under criminal investigation or have outstanding loans. And the Russia needs to recruit at least 280,000 people in 2025 to maintain its replacement rate. Yeah, so they need a little south of 300,000 people a year to stay in the fight. That's a lot of casualties, and I would say that's about half of their manning really in Ukraine. They have about little, north or south of 600,000 depending on the month in Ukraine. So anyway, Western and Ukraine officials continue to report North Korean forces have withdrawn from frontline positions in Kursk Oblast. It was stated by the New York Times that Ukrainian U.S. officials stated that Russian military command pulled the North Korean forces in Kursk from the battlefield after suffering heavy casualties, and that Ukrainian forces have not seen North Korean forces for about 2 weeks, since about 17 January. U.S. officials know that the withdrawal of North Korean forces from the battlefield may be temporary, and that North Korean forces could return to combat after receiving more training or after Russian military command comes up with a way to deploy North Korean forces and avoid such high losses. Imagine Kim Jong Un is a little pissed off about that. Uh, Ukrainian officials know that North Korean forces disorganization, lack of cohesion with Russian forces, quickly increased North Korean casualties. Um, New York Times reported that North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un might expect Russia's help in advancing North Korea's missile program as well as diplomatic assistance at the UN in exchange for sending North Korean forces to Russia. It was stated by Siersky that Ukrainian forces have inflicted roughly 5,500 casualties. Okay, that's even more than I thought. Someone was asking me in chat last night about casualties, so this is the figure that Siersky said. Um, he said that Ukrainian forces inflicted 5,500 casualties on the 11 to 12,000 strong North Korean contingent. I was saying about 1,000 dead and about 3,000 wounded, so a little south of that, but that's yeah, that's a lot. Report withdrawal of North Korean forces follows repeated statements from Ukrainian officials noting that North Korean troops were suffering unsustainable casualty rates in Kursk. All right, and mobilization in Ukraine. Uh, the U.S. transferred Patriot missiles from Israel to Poland is expected to deliver them to Ukraine. It was about roughly 90 decommissioned Patriot missiles were stored in Israel, were sent to Poland, and will probably be shipped to Ukraine on an unspecified date. Over the last week, the UK, Finland, and Czechia announced several immediate and longer-term military assistance packages for Ukraine on January 31st. Um, Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov stated on the 31st that the UK will provide Ukraine the military assistance package of over £2 billion, um, primar- primarily for the purchase of air defense systems and funding for the localization of defense production in Ukraine. The Finns will provide a new tranche of $207 million, And the Czech foreign minister stated on the 31st that the Czech government is considering creating a new initiative to purchase artillery ammunition for Ukraine. That would always be good. And last thing, rear activity for the Russians. The Russians continue to illegally deport Ukrainian children from occupied Crimea and Russia under the guise of the evacuation and rehabilitation programs. Ukrainian presidential advisor on children's issues, Daria Hersha, I'm sorry, I can't enunciate that, Daria, reported on the 2nd that Russia has illegally deported at least 20,000 children since 2022. Ukraine has repatriated at least 1,100 of these children in support of humanitarian organizations from Qatar, South Africa, and the Vatican. Um, the stated that Russian authorities have killed Ukrainian parents, kidnapped their children, and transported the children to rehabilitation evacuation camps in occupied Crimea. The stated that Russian authorities have separated children from their families in illegal filtration camps. Ukraine's Regional Human Rights Center identified 13 such rehabilitation evacuation camps in occupied Crimea alone. And Russian authorities reportedly used the camps in occupied Crimea to indoctrinate and militarize children, Ukrainian children, before further deporting them to Russia for adoption. Okay, so that does it for the brief here, guys. Let me close this out, and I'll bring up the article I wanted to share with you about Ukraine transitioning over to the core system. Let me just bring it up here as soon as I can find the article window I want to share with you. Gotta do the whole thing here with finding it on the right window. Make sure that looks correct. Yeah, it looks good. All right, here we go. Okay, this was shared by somebody in our chat. I asked for sources because this seemed a little odd and different, but yeah. So this was talked for a while that Ukraine would be transitioning from a gaggle of brigade forces and brigade grouping of forces sort of thing in some areas to a core system. So for people that don't know, this is a way of organizing larger forces within the Army force organization structure. What that means is that if you have an echelon, or sorry, how to put it, a a chain of command, basically, I guess you can say. If you organize your troops into groupings depending on numbers, roughly above company it goes to battalion, it's 1,000. Brigades or regiments would be roughly 4,000, and then up to division would be roughly 10,000, and then corps would be a grouping of divisions. In this case, it would be groupings of brigades typically. And the way it's being organized, it sounds like with half of them being, well, Azov. Yeah, so that's rather interesting. So we'll get into the meat of the article here. Today, Commander-in-Chief General Sierski reported that um, reported to Zelensky that the plan to regularly organize the armed forces of Ukraine, including the creation of a new corps, has been approved and is being actively implemented. These corps will be structured around experienced brigades and their commanders, granting them increased responsibility and autonomy. The armed forces of Ukraine currently has 6 corps: the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, along with the 7th Rapid Response Corps, and of the Air Assault Forces and the 30th Marine Corps of the Navy. Yuri Budasov, the editor-in-chief of UkraineCensor.net, shared new details about the ongoing transformation of the Ukrainian armed forces during his regular Budasov Line show on YouTube. According to Budasov, the command intends to establish up to 20 Army Corps. So that's a lot. To scale up the top brigades and build new forces around them. Each corps will be assigned a specific area of responsibility and will oversee at least 5 brigades. All existing corps structures will be restructured into combat corps, no longer serving solely as administrative units in the rear. The operational strategic groups, or OSOVs, anyway, operational tactical groups and tactical groups will be disbanded, then with the corps eventually assuming control of the front lines. The 30th Marine Corps will undergo a complete reform as it currently functions primarily as an administrative body, with Marine units scattered across the entire front line. Additionally, the Marines will receive extra staffing, as some units have yet to recover from the Krinky operation. Goodness, God, that was so long ago. God damn. That's anyway. So much has been revealed recently about the bad decisions by Ukrainian generals recently. There's a lot of good ones. Don't get me wrong, really, like Belitsky, Prokopenko, um, some others, along with Zaluzhny, solid dudes. But like Krinky was unnecessary. It should have been called off way before. There was a great day by day video done on well, I forgot there was a channel on YouTube that documents all these things. Um, Forgot the name of the channel, but if you type in Krinky Operation, you might be able to find it. But yeah, it anyway, it culminated way earlier than they pulled out. Anyway, it was an absolute just attrition. Those Marines were highly trained and they weren't respected for their skill sets, and a lot of casualties occurred because of bad decisions. So. The new corps formation. So here, this is the good news. According to Yuri Budusov, the 3rd Assault will be restructured into the 3rd Army Corps. The new formation will be led by none other than Andrei Beletsky, the founder of the brigade and the Azov movement. Oh boy. Yeah. Former political prisoner, colonel, and now more than likely General Beletsky. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. The 92nd Assault Brigade, really good brigade, will be upgraded to a corps, likely the 92nd Army Corps. And the National Guard of Ukraine will adopt a corps structure. The first corps will be formed around the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov and will be led by Denis Prokopenko. Damn. Talk about a home fucking run. The second corps is planned to be based out of the 13th Operational Assignment Brigade Kartia, which is under the current commander Ihor Obolensky at the helm. Yuri Budusov did not disclose his sources, so the information shared above should be treated as unconfirmed. While the majority of what Budusov has reported in the past has proven to be accurate, some details turned out to be false. For instance, he recently claimed that the formation of the 158th, 59th, 60th, and 162nd Mechanized has been halted, yet official sources confirmed that they are still being formed. As a result, the sources above will not be included in the military lands database. But that would be interesting. So let's just look at some of the comments here. So in a nutshell, the politically motivated Azov brigades will be transformed to corps, multiplying by 5 their troops to be able to act independently. This will mean that they will be probably continue to receive the best of Western material. Oh man. Anyway, this is interesting because it kind of there was a possibility I talked about a couple years ago, maybe last year. I forgot. Anyway, what I was saying was that because it was likely that Ukraine would not join NATO, would not be able to join NATO immediately in the war, that Ukraine would be in this weird neutral state position between two great powers, and this would be similar to the interwar period in Europe writ large, right? Because the West is largely occupied by the United States and its soft power. At the time I was saying that, now the USA aid is dried up. That's kind of a different story, but you get what I'm saying. By doing that, that meant that democracies could stand on their own. Same thing with Russia; they have their own ambitions and stuff. But the special case with the interwar period is that there was no occupying force. France and Britain withdrew to their countries, and a lot of these democracies that were born out of the interwar period right after World War One, half of those became dictatorships of some sort. Some with far right, some with oligarchic interests, some just whatever, just weird amalgamations. Um, and what we're seeing right now with Ukraine, especially being in this weird paradigm between being a neutral spot essentially between two great power rivalries, is that we're seeing that there is enough room for them to breathe new nationalist institutions. And that's what we saw again in the interwar period. These are just the natural evolution of European countries, is to have these sort of institutions grow naturally in the time of security and necessity like this. When there's an existential fight, nationalists step up to the plate. And this is part of that process. So I'm happy to see that. This is a testament to a theory I had. I'm not going to say I predicted this because that's just grifting and gay, but it does confirm something I was thinking about. Again, if this is false, it's false. But again, if this is true from Yuri Budasov, should be interesting. Should be very interesting because Andrei Beletsky has a huge amount of infrastructure behind him, and I'm not going to say Prokopenko is subordinate to him, but yeah, it's just they have an interesting relationship. It's very close, and they've been through a lot together, I think. Um, yeah, it's It's exciting, but we'll see how it goes. All right. Oh yeah, we also had the Africa file to go over. Uh, you know what? I just don't. After talking about that, I think that just kind of dragged down the show. But we could just kind of show what's been going on in the Congo here. Uh, so again, Rwanda here, M23 is a Tutsi rebellion, and they captured. Oh, what's the name of that city? Sake, right here, right? They closed this off in the west of the Congo, and then with Lake Kivu to their back, a lot of the militias and Congolese forces in this area had to surrender and were basically destroyed. So now the M23 is on this side of Lake Kivu. Goma, a city of 1 to 2 million people, is now under M23 and by extension Rwandan control. This is a big city. It's a kind of the what's the right term? Linchpin in a lot of the mineral resources. You can see on the map right here, bottom right. A lot of the Democratic, a lot of the Congolese resources are up in the east, where there's a mountain range, and that is a major problem for them if they're going to keep up their economy. The government is out of Kinshasa, and they've been panicking a lot about this, though. There were some Romanian mercenaries that surrendered because of this. They were obviously protecting some of the interests of somebody very rich over there. But yeah, anyway, so this is again a good map of the area of operations, the M23 in this area, Goma being in the middle right there, and how far they pushed out. Some mining interests, obviously, in this area. You can see gold mining in yellow right there, cassiterite in blue, and then light blue is the coltan mining. I'm not sure exactly what those resources are, but I'm sure they're very important. Anyway, yeah, that's just a bit of it there, guys. I'm going to leave it there because we had a good show, and I will leave it at that. We'll talk a bit more about Congo, I think, next show, though, because I'm sure there'll be a bit more to talk about as that shakes out and we see the consequences of that in the near future. And yeah, anyone listening, please do something good this week. And for anyone in Ukraine listening to this, Godspeed and good hunting. And that'll be it, guys. I will see you next week, and I'll see you on next Monday's live show. Have a good week.